All right, and so we can start. So I think it'd be a good place to start, maybe just with an intro from you, Sasha, just so people can get to know a little bit of who you are.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Val. Um, yeah, I've been working in the Web3 space for about 2.5 years now. Before then, I worked in fintech for many years. Indiegogo. I ran a peer-to-peer lending startup for a while. Um, Another fundraising startup before then. All together, I've been working as an engineer for about 15 years. I'm based out of New Orleans, and my pronouns are she, they. I don't know. Is there any other background you'd like me to give?
Yeah, so I think just to kind of kick off the conversation, I would really love to hear what led you to work in engineering in the first place. Was there like a pivotal moment that kind of brought you into that space?
Yeah. Before I was an engineer, I worked in telemarketing for many years, and then before that, fast food. Um, I wasn't very stable with telemarketing, and I was always losing my jobs for the same reason, which was that I would always circumvent whatever network restrictions that they had in place and show all the other people how to do it. And I don't know, I just couldn't not like it be my first day on the job, and I would find a way around it. And there was a very large company that I worked for once, MCI. It's not around anymore, but they were they had some really well thought out restrictions. But I remember figuring out how to get past them by going through their knowledge base, and there was a employee policy document that could open in Word. And from Word, I save the text file, and then I click Save As again, and then rename the text file to a batch file, and then use that to download an alternate browser, and then use that to play MP3s for all the other people in our bay for like. And the next morning, there was a team of 10 network admins at my desk trying to figure out how I got around the restrictions. They let me go off from that job eventually. Um, but I lived in a small town, and there was a word going around that I was good with computers, and someone needed someone to maintain a website. And I didn't know anything about web programming at the time, and I learned PHP that weekend, and I worked there for 7 years, learning Ruby, PHP, JavaScript, building all sorts of applications. And that's how I got into engineering, at least. I don't have a bachelor's degree or anything. It was just kind of like something that I had always wanted to be, like a coder, but I don't know, I still had kind of an imposter syndrome all the way until moving to San Francisco. I like didn't feel like I was a legit engineer.
Definitely, that's a really interesting way to get into engineering, and I'm sure that is also like a very funny moment for your coworkers as well. So kind of based off of that, I like to ask this question about that moment where you realized that you wanted to work in crypto, or as most folks call it now, more generally Web3. Was there a liberating moment that kind of led you to the crypto space? I think everyone has that one kind of moment where they realize that, oh, this is what I actually want to do. This is the space that's really interesting and gives a little bit more texture to what the internet can be and can look like.
Oh yeah, I'd say I was always interested in blockchain technology ever since I was working at a peer-to-peer lending startup, and one of the biggest reasons why we couldn't help more people was because we had to operate within the existing financial regulation system. And we had to gain investment through the existing financial system. And it was like 2014, and it's a little bit before blockchain really started to take off. But once it started to be taken more seriously, I started to explore the technology behind it, and I realized that a lot of the problems that we had with going to market and regulation could have been solved by if we had like a blockchain type product. So that's when I very first started getting into it. One area where I've always been interested in blockchain technology is in anti-censorship. I remember one of the very first times I tried to explore something on the blockchain was there was this documentary called India's Daughter that was released around that time, 2014, 2015, and there was word going around that that was trying to be censored, and they were using like DMCA and all sorts of stuff to try to prevent the film from circulating, and I got really upset about it and tried to post the entire movie on the blockchain and quickly found out that I couldn't do that. But I did successfully post the magnet hash on the blockchain because that was less than the amount of message size that I could post. So I feel like censorship is like a big thing that and that goes hand in hand with decentralization, and it's also a challenge at the same time. Because how do you advocate for privacy but also maintain the ability for something to be indexable but also secure and free from prying eyes? There's this kind of perspective that, like, a lot of people hear about the Second Amendment and it's kind of like a thing about guns, but I have this feeling that the Second Amendment isn't really about that. It's about the right to resist and have privacy and the ability to organize against, like, oppressive forces. And I think decentralization goes hand in hand with that, both like network decentralization and censorship, that kind of thing. So those are sort of the factors that led me to be interested in working for a blockchain company.
Yeah, that I feel like that really resonates, and probably with a lot of folks here and a lot of folks in the space in general. A lot of those reasons of wanting to be able to maintain your privacy, wanting to resist censorship. That's a big part of the reason I think this space exists. And I wonder also, like, if for you that your motivation and your like belief system maybe around that, was it something that was developed before you started exploring the blockchain and cryptography space, or was it something that kind of evolved afterwards?
Well, I think hearing about friends' experiences at Standing Rock was a big wake-up moment for me, and also kind of like the resistance against surveillance with police and them like not allowing people to film them. During Standing Rock, there was like this issue where someone would be streaming to Facebook, trying to build solidarity, awareness of what was happening to the protesters, and then they would just shut down the cell towers. Things that we develop that advocate for decentralized network infrastructures are also helpful to countries which don't have free speech in the same way that we do. Another project I've been interested in is decentralization through analog means. Like, we used to live in a much more decentralized world. In a way, the postal service is a certain type of decentralization too. And mail and all of these other types of things that you wouldn't think are really like modern, but they have the ability to also be decentralized as well. So I think the blockchain is just like a new technology that enables a certain type of thinking. But certainly when that happened at Standing Rock, I started getting really interested in WebRTC and peer-to-peer streaming, and like, how can we make it so that there's no way for like any kind of centralized network agency to cut a connection from a protester. And I think that's like part of why like that's like the news thing that like really started to get me to think about specifically decentralized messaging. Like, it's clearly a problem right now that, like, it's great that WhatsApp and Facebook Messenger have all of these like end-to-end encryption and things like that, but like, I honestly don't want to live in that type of technocracy, like where like it's Facebook that gets to make the rules about what privacy means to them and they interpret it, and people like, that's not a democratic system necessarily. Same thing with WhatsApp. It's all the same. So it doesn't matter what type of end-to-end encryption like any of these platforms really have, if it's not like owned by the people, audited by the people, and developed by the people, like in a decentralized way, then I think it has the same inherent flaw that someone can subpoena WhatsApp, someone can subpoena Messenger. They can and that goes WSO for countries like Iran, China, North Korea, where there's even a totally different regulatory landscape. So I think there's a huge need, and blockchain and Web3 are a huge part of it to develop technologies that circumvent any kind of centralized control over free speech.
Yeah, I feel like you give a really great explanation of that and some great examples as well. And I think that's one part of the space that, especially as people are coming in for the first time, can be overlooked, or can be hidden almost, because there's so much focus on the financial aspects, right? Crypto and investing in crypto. And so sometimes that gets lost. The other thing I was hoping that you would just talk a little bit more about Standing Rock for those who don't have that context of what Standing Rock means and what that was and why it's been important in the US.
Well, yeah, there was a pipeline that was being built through areas that were really important to certain tribes, like in South Dakota around 2014, 2015. And some of you may have more background on this than me, but I had some friends who went out to go camp and protest against that pipeline being built. And it wasn't really fair. It was kind of like a perpetuation of kind of this attitude that those lands don't seriously matter when compared to the interests of oil companies. And but it was really messed up because this was really sacred land for them. And they're doing it just so that they could they don't have to build the pipeline. They can go around. They make less money, but they didn't have to. And people were really understandably upset at that. And also, it's just the way that our relationships with the Native Americans have always, it's okay, past is the past, but if we continue to do it, and that whole thing about if you don't do anything about it, then you're really complicit in it. It is really an unfortunate situation because there was some direct action against the pipeline, people directly interfering with the operations of the contractors building the pipelines. And so the police started to spar with the tribes. There started to be tear gas. There started to be a lot of kind of things that were going overboard. It was getting really escalated really quickly. And as part of that, people started to stream what was happening up there and those escalations on the police side and, the police planting things to make it look like the protesters did things. And the police didn't like that. And they had the ability to see which people were live streaming from what locations. And then they could just talk to Verizon and have them shut down that cell tower, at any time. And so to some degree, we won't ever necessarily know the extent of the degree to which the police had overstepped their bounds and what happened really, because they that was the case where they limited free speech in the US. And that still happens in some ways. I mean, you only see the videos that get out. It's hard to see the videos that get suppressed. And yeah, we usually think of the blockchain and things like that as being something solely financial, but there's huge implications because it's a decentralized system and there's no way to remove information on it. And it has value for that as well. It has value for message passing. It has value for communications. It has value for anti-censorship. All of these things and it also has value for governance and democracy and digital autonomous organizations that, we can actually have things that people vote on and have a cryptographically provable participation model for decision making and policy making. And that wasn't necessarily possible before. There was always some kill switch somewhere that a government could do. And a big part of what enables all of that is the blockchain. So I don't know if things would have been different back then if those technologies had been more popular, but I do know that there's been a lot of work in decentralization, IPFS, there's a matrix protocol, there's all of these technologies that are decentralized for kind of mitigating some of this stuff. I think the hardest thing actually to do is streaming video on those types of things, just a challenge even with a centralized architecture. But my hope is that if maybe in 5 years, it'll be a lot harder for governments to suppress speech and the free flow of information because the decentralization community will have grown so much. Mesh networks will have grown so much. We won't have the situation where we have single ISPs the US, and the circumstances by which they were able to squash the free speech, like in South Dakota, like maybe those won't exist in 5 years. And so working with Web3 is a big part of that.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. It's super important. I want to go back a little bit to your career path, and it'd be great if you could just talk about, from the perspective of the developer, like how things are different when you're working for a Web2 company versus a company that, focuses on decentralization. So you talked about working for this like peer-to-peer lending startup. And now, obviously, you're about to join Conduit full time. So, can you talk about just like from a career perspective, what makes those things unique?
I think the biggest difference is like working with like MetaMask and like blockchains. It's a very different type of backend. It's nothing quite like making a REST call where it's like certainly complete or not complete. It's kind of like you fire off a thing, call a function on a smart contract, and it's like sort of happened, sort of didn't. You launched it off, but it hasn't been confirmed that like the method has necessarily been called, and it's like there's all these design patterns that go into it that are a little bit awkward, a little bit weird, and there's frameworks for kind of working around those things, but it's just like it's a very different thing because it's not like the traditional type of transactional interface that you see on servers. And there's also other problems that like there are challenges, like with a server, you can just have index database of transactions and find all transactions that match such criteria. If you're interfacing directly with the blockchain, then you kind of have to crawl through the transactions and keep some sort of cache of them. And so I haven't found like a really solid, like purely decentralized system that was like absolutely decentralized, because there's always like some sort of use case that requires some indexing like into the chain or like some monitoring of processes on the chain. But like for apps that work just with like, let's say a private chain instance or something like that, I've seen some really cool stuff that it's been really interesting to work on and develop. I think the biggest challenge for me is just that like the client side libraries for interfacing with the blockchains like have had some churn, and there was some rough tooling support, like trying to integrate with blockchain contracts with TypeScript using like shifting versions of the MetaMask like JS SDK. That's like kind of tricky and challenging, and then on top of that, then there's the UX things.
Yeah, we had a few folks in here, I think, who are part of a program called the Consensus Academy Bootcamp that just got completed. Congrats to people who were in that and got to the end. And so I think people can probably like resonate with some of those difficulties of like the client-side libraries being, having outdated documentation or just changing out from under you very constantly. And I think a good way to kind of summarize it is the space is just really young, and so a lot of the tools are just not really mature. Would you kind of agree with that as like a overarching summary?
Yeah, it feels really nascent in some ways because like I just haven't seen it work as smoothly as I thought it should work yet. Like I've always like still been some Stack Overflow trying to debug like why like this way of signing like a thing doesn't work the same in Node.js versus the browser, or like this particular library for interfacing with a contract works differently in different like deployments. And then like also on top of that, the tooling was kind of challenging from a development perspective directly, because like you might want to have like a local chain instance to run test transactions, and like the unit testing, ET testing, like all of that stuff is still a little bit like it still feels really fresh. And it's not that it's like it's not like it's impossible to develop things on the blockchain. It's just challenging, and I think there are huge benefits to it, like in terms of decentralization. But I think that's why, like, when it comes down to it, a lot of companies aren't purely decentralized. They usually have some sort of centralized component just to make that a little easier, because I feel like want to like reduce the amount of like integration space with the chain, because there is so much churn there and the tools are so like nascent. So I think it's like that's probably why there's been so much kind of like, decentralized architecture with a centralized buddy.
Yeah, totally. I see that a lot as well. So we have a question in the chat here, and as folks have questions, just feel free to drop them, and we'll try to pick them up as we go. So Alicia asked, have you used protocols like the Graph protocol for blockchain indexing, or Pocket Network for decentralized blockchain nodes for dealing with these centralized blockchain services? And if so, do you know if they work well?
Yeah, I don't have too much experience with that. Like the recent work I've done in the blockchain, I started off with creating a governance system, and what we ended up doing was we built like a GraphQL resolver that kind of handled some of this stuff. Ultimately, that was centralized. Those technologies weren't super developed at the time that we had done that stuff. So, and towards the end of my last engagement, like that centralized buddy became the entire thing that we did. And pretty soon there was like no work happening on the crypto contracts, and the plan was to go back to it eventually. But like we just took off like on the App Store thing, with like it was like a go-to-market plan to bring awareness to the token. But ultimately what we wanted to do never really panned out, and that's why I'm excited to be starting at Conduit soon, because get back to refreshing in that space. And I was really passionate about the governance aspect of it. I know there's been development on this since the last time I interfaced with it, so I'm excited to see what's out there, and I'll definitely check those out.
Cool. And then another follow-up question from Alicia. So how do teams handle things like sharing private keys for dev deployment accounts and avoid committing them to code repositories?
I didn't like the way we handled it at our last company. Good to say that. We used this thing called Vault, and it was a pain that to set up and Dockerize and get to run locally. There was always problems with that. Like, I've seen the things like storing keys with like some sort of secondary encryption inside like LastPass and stuff like that. There's like enterprise level tools for like storing secrets, but generally, yeah, of course, we don't commit like certain things to Git repositories. Usually there's like a config file, and there's a development and test file, and those have like distribution state keys, and then the production file has a completely different system for like getting that stuff into the app. And usually it's kind of convoluted. And I guess that's kind of like a thing that's changed a little bit. Like it's not even just a Web3 thing. It's just that I feel like development has just gotten really complicated over the past couple of years, and with Web3 even more so to some degree. Like I kind of missed the days like when it was just like Rails and it did everything, and you didn't have like 100 kilobyte left pad function and this big framework like on the front end, and then like back then there was just like these really canonical server-side frameworks that everyone seemed to use, like Django and Rails. And today it's like more of a mishmash of Node.js and Go. And yes, there's popular frameworks in each of them, but I feel like it's just a really fragmented space these days. And like most people use like either environment variables, or they'll have like some sort of signing chain. I think the most complicated one of all of them is like Apple's like push notification, certificate provisioning, and signing chain. It's just like, it's always a 19-step process that you'll spend days on. And it's like to trade the security for like usability. It's like a very unfriendly process, especially if you want to use a third-party intermediary to manage those push notifications.
Yeah, that's a really great rundown. I'll pass it over to Gabrielle to keep this going.
Yeah, and with all of that, it's kind of like I'm getting a little bit of PTSD from my own work, and also, having to juggle so many different things, especially working on the security side. I have conversations about usability versus security all the time. And kind of with that, I would love to hear your thoughts on how do you envision like better product in terms of design and usability and development? Are there things that you wish were in this space right now that are a little bit more streamlined and a little less complicated?
I think that with any kind of emerging technology, there's always this like lag time for designers to catch up to it, like and start like giving it some TLC. And I think that's like a lot of these blockchain companies, they just have like the fanciest landing pages and it looks so sleek and they're like all like futuristic and they've got all these effects on them. When you go to use them, the UX is like kind of lacking and it's like awkward a lot of times. And it's just like, it looks pretty sometimes, but I don't think that some of the primitives are necessarily there for handling a lot of the UX that people are used to. Just like the confirmation time for a transaction, like that by itself, like there's not really good deferred, like, and underneath that, on the framework level, it's like, I feel like I wish there were more of an abstraction for asynchronous things that like need to be called off, like, some sort of long promise or something like that. I know that there's some cool stuff in functional programming that I can like make that a little bit easier, but again, it's all possible, but it's not really an established pattern quite yet. So I think in order to empower good UX, I think I would like to see more frameworks to handle some of these things that people are used to, like in like traditional web apps that aren't as easy in decentralized apps, unless you just like have kind of a centralized thing, or you just optimistically assume that things have gone through. Which I mean, there's apps certainly that do that. They're just like, they record that we fired off a transaction, we trust that it's going to complete. Yeah, I'm not sure if that necessarily answers your question, but I think I would like to see better UX primitives for things that happen on chain, like calling methods on contracts. I'd love to see more consensus around governance. Like I was working on a governance interface a while back, and there's just like a lot of ways to do it. And they're all, it's like, it feels like early social networks, like back then when like every social network was just like a little bit different, and some of them had like a poke button and like this kind of stuff. And it feels like that was decentralized like governance interfaces. And I think the reason why that is because like people are still trying things and testing things out, and some things have taken off, but they've only taken off from a specific niche audience. And so like, I think what needs to happen in order for UX to take more focus, and therefore the DX that would support that UX to take more focus, is that there needs to be like something that's massively popular. Like I really liked the idea of diaspora, like when it first came out, like the Facebook alternative, and like today, like Mastodon protocol and stuff like that. And that stuff is, but it's like there's this whole problem that like these big social media companies, they have so much power to squash anything that's like really like, ran by the community. Like they just like override it with their like unfair influence. And it's just like I think almost one of the best things to happen like recently in this space was actually the Facebook outage. Like we were talking about outages earlier, like where they like it was an allegation, but like that they had to like send engineers with angled writers to get back to their servers because someone issued like a bad command and it shut down all of WhatsApp like worldwide. That was actually, I think, a really cool experience in a certain way. Yes, it was bad for many communities that depend on WhatsApp to like send critical things. There's like whole communities that were shut down because of that, but that's a wake-up call. Like that's like, oh crap, we shouldn't be dependent on like one company for our entire infrastructure and things like that. And I wouldn't be surprised if like things like Mastodon started to get more popular and people are like, and like all the stuff around YouTube and like content licensing, like when these companies start really messing up, like then people can see that like, oh well, it doesn't matter what they say, we can't trust them. Like, and then they start like thinking like, okay, they'll start googling like they're an alternative to Facebook, and I see like kind of like a big challenge there is like, how does Mastodon even like compete with like these social media companies? How does Matrix Protocol, if it like, it can't just live inside Hacker News, it has to like have some sort of foothold like to actually become like widely adopted enough so that there is UX like attention to it. And until it's like a chicken and egg problem, like that companies like Facebook, they have a way to solve it just like with their unfair influence, but like I haven't seen like a corresponding thing on the decentralized side that like does it. I feel like it has to be like a private company that uses a decentralized like backbone, like at like underneath the hood, it's like Mastodon. That way, like Mastodon gets really popular or something like that, or Matrix. But yeah, I think that there's still a lot of work left, like almost like with this the marketing side of crypto and the community adoption side of crypto. And another opportunity for that to happen, I think, is disasters as well. Things like censorship disasters, areas where their centralized communication platforms have been shut down because of like some sort of natural event, or like, you know, Sandy Rock is another example of that, like where, okay, it becomes obvious that we can't trust the centralized model anymore. So that's like when things like fire chat, like direct Bluetooth to Bluetooth, like message sending and mesh networks, like kind of come into play. And until those things like really take off, until like the social media companies like really like start to show their true colors and start to mess up a lot more, I don't think we're gonna really like see mainstream adoption of a lot of these things. It's always gonna be like niche.
Definitely. And I agree with all of this. I think about my first times interacting with MetaMask and just being kind of shocked at how long that transaction time was before it was confirmed. But I do want to pivot the conversation a little bit to just kind of maybe going back a little bit earlier to talking about how you may have overcame working with your own imposter syndrome. I know it's I want to hear, was that a little bit different moving into the crypto space, or what did that look like for you? Were there any strategies that kind of helped you get to a base level of like, I can do this, like, and this is stuff that I've been doing for a long time?
Well, okay, so my first 7 years like in engineering, I like was a network admin, but also wrote code for all the reporting systems, but also like did things like ran cable and set up and like clean keyboards. Like I did everything that there was to do that was related to a computer. I was like the computer person, and that was like almost like my title. Like, and so I was not an official software engineer at all. And so when I started interviewing to be a software engineer, I like thought when I moved to San Francisco, I like moved from a small town. And moved to San Francisco, and it was a big city, and like it was just so taken aback, but I also just didn't believe it was happening. At the same time, I thought that they would like send me an email like the second day I worked and be like, wait, you're not actually a software engineer. But I remember like the way I reacted to that kind of thing was I just like really studied. I read this book like Test-Driven Application Development with Ruby like 7 times. Every time I was going to interview, I would read that book from front to back over and over again. I would spend every morning on the bus, I would review all the updates to jQuery and every like new ECMAScript like protocol. Like I just like, I didn't feel like I was a legit engineer, so I like really like put a lot of pressure on myself to be the most like knowledgeable about everything that we worked with from day to day, like at the company I worked at. So there used to be this site called Railscast, and I would just binge watch like development tutorials, refactoring patterns every night. And it was like that for months. And before I started to like feel like in every situation at work, I usually was like way ahead of like most of the other people. I don't think that was necessarily the healthiest way to counter it, but it kind of wore off after a while, especially after like it felt like people respected me differently. There's a secondary imposter syndrome that I feel like I've been encountering for the last like 2 years, like with transitioning. That's been like, can people take me seriously, like with this new way that I'm presenting? And is that changing things like about the way people take me seriously? And part of me is like just like is very defiant and doesn't care, but part of me actually feels it. Like people do like approach me differently, and I kind of have have gotten it back, where like I feel like I'm like kind of like overcompensating in like technical interviews when I didn't have to before, and I don't know how like to kind of get past that other than to unplug from opportunities where I feel like that, because it's not every opportunity where I'm talking to someone and I feel that way. It's just like sometimes people don't take me seriously like they used to, and I don't know why that is, but I like have this suspicion it's just because I'm presenting differently and there's some different dynamics involved there.
I think that piece you said about really unplugging from those opportunities is incredibly cogent and something that I am definitely going to remember from this conversation. I think it's not talked about enough when you feel that from a potential opportunity. I do want to take a question from the audience. Let's see. So one of our members asks, so how do you think Web3 tech will evolve the music industry? Do you see any trends or any direction in which tools and services would be valuable to build with Web3 tech?
Well, that's an amazing question. I am a musician, as you can tell by the piano to my left. Is still in frame. I didn't use the blur background thing, but yeah, music is like I'd say it's like probably one of my biggest passions. I try not to make work the biggest factor in my life. And for me, the thing that's most important to me is creativity and music, and it's a really exciting time right now. Like it's super cool. Everything that's happening with NFTs and licensing, and I have an album on Spotify, and I can't even control any of the things. Like I have a YouTube channel out there that the distribution company set up for me that I don't even have any control over. And it's crazy. I couldn't go take something down or update. That's a totally separate thing from my actual YouTube channel. And that's all going to change very soon, because there's this rug that's going to get really pulled out from under a lot of the traditional distribution models, and it's been a slow sinking ship for a while. Honestly, it started with MP3s, but then it's just Radiohead releasing In Rainbows direct to people. I have a friend who only released an album on hard copy, and it's becoming to the point where it's okay, it's actually in demand if it's not on YouTube or if it's not on SoundCloud, and it's become, if it's only available as an NFT, or you can only get it by scanning a QR code in some random neighborhood in some part of the country or something like that. It's just a changing world with respect to that, and I think it's a world where the artists are really taking things back. And they're okay, we can build our own financial infrastructure, and it's not going to be long before there's a digital autonomous organization that's ran by creatives, where people can come up with alternative ways of handling IP, licensing, royalties, all that type of stuff is just begging for disruption, and NFTs are just the beginning of it. And it's just I'm as an artist, I'm so excited to see what's going to happen in the next couple of years with that. It's just it's a marrying of all the things I'm passionate about all into one. So, yeah.
I want to leave the last two questions for Val, if you want to ask any more. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, okay, so I guess as we're getting a little bit towards the end, I want to come back a bit to just your experience, transitioning and how that's the experiences you've had with different companies during that transition as well. And in particular, I'm hoping that you'll talk about, how you evaluate who you want to work with, because I think one kind of key aspect of this space is, as we talked about, there's a lot of opportunity with the new technologies that we are able to use, but it really does come down to who's building, right? Who is ultimately the person who is building these things and has control of the systems. And so I'm wondering how you make that consideration when it comes to your career in terms of who you work with.
I know a big consideration has always been remote. I used to live in San Francisco, and I used to just have such bright eyes for technology, and I used to be so excited about it. But like in the past 5 years, I just like wanted to move to the mountains and like paint and make music sometimes, like just because it's gotten like dystopian and weird, and like all the things I used to be passionate about have like this kind of like soil on them, and like the Web3 is like one of the few things left that's like a hope for technology, that like technology will can possibly be a force for good. But the way it's been trending, like it's been like, oh my gosh, everything that I used to look up to like is doing something like bad. They're like selling data, violating privacy. They're like cooperating with governments, developing censorship tools. I don't like any of that stuff. It's like, and so I think, like, to follow on to your question, like I was the first remote person at my last company, and they didn't want to go remote at all. But my argument was that if you get all the same people from the same area who are like by definition are going to like live in somewhat similar socioeconomic conditions and social conditions, then you're going to get groupthink, and it's going to be, there won't be a truly diverse set of opinions, like either culturally or geographically. And I think it's like really important to have people from all over the country. I think it's also important to embrace remote work because there's different types of family styles. There's people who need to take care of kids who like they live in a certain place because of the schools, and like I think a truly forward-thinking company is going to be open to being flexible to different types of family structures, different types of cultures, different people who work around the world. Like as long as the time zones they can work out, I think that's like the very first sniff test. Like how remote are they? Are they only remote with their engineers? Like, are they remote with everyone? Like, do only engineers get the privilege of that, or does like customer service also get the privilege of doing that? Like, and is that different? Of course, there's like a kind of like a diversity thing. Do I see like all the same type of person when I like interview with a company? If I go to the company's about page, is it really homogenous? Like, am I could be like the token diversity hire? Is like, and that causes doubt for me. Like, when I'm the only person who's like different at a company, then I start to question like whether I'm being interviewed because of the like merits of my skills or something like that. So that's like a reason why I wouldn't even like interview at a company sometimes, just because like I'm like, I don't want to navigate that, and I don't want to be asked questions and be the person that people go to ask about things. It's not my job to educate people like on this and that, like with regards to transitioning, or for people to walk on eggshells around pronouns, or like just to be that person. And I don't like being that person. Like, and so it's kind of a challenge in some ways. Like I like obviously like Bay Area companies, they really want to be forward thinking, but it's so surprising. Like actually, I had some more trouble at some like just because like there's this thing that's like it's not, you're not allowed to think anything different other than like the dominant liberal like kind of thought, and it's not necessarily even agreed upon what that is, and what that actually results in is a lack of discourse and dialogue, and people kind of like blindly following like certain ideologies just because they don't want to get shamed. And so I felt like some of the accommodations of companies in the Bay Area were like superficial. Like, yes, they have like the field on their employee directory asking what your pronouns are. Yes, everyone in Slack has like their pronouns next to their name, but how deep does it really go? Like how like are they just like superficially doing that, or is it in truth that like there's only one non-binary restroom and it's like a single stall and it's always in use, and like I have to run to like the chai store down the street like really fast because it's like the only place I can go to the bathroom. Like I've had that experience, and early on in transitioning, it was kind of hard because like I was identified as non-binary, and like that was a difficulty, and like yeah, a lot of people at the company were fine with my pronouns, and then there was the people who just didn't care and only did it because they didn't want to get shamed, and it like really showed through. And as time went on, like, and I transitioned more and more, like, it kind of came to the point where people didn't know I was trans, like, unless I started talking about something really technical, and then my voice would drop sometimes, and then like that would happen, and it still happens sometimes. But like that's a whole different like thing where, okay, it used to be that I like people could tell I was like, you know, my assigned gender at birth, they could tell that, like, and then it got to the point where they couldn't, and it changed the dynamic. It was like weird because people were like, oh yeah, you're trans, we're hip, we're cool, we'll like, yeah, but you're actually this, like underneath the hood. And then it was like the weirdest, most messed up thing because like when people thought that, they didn't treat me that differently. But when I started to really present and pass, then I would get things I'd never heard before in like an interview process. Like, oh, you have worked in the industry for a long time. Oh, you actually do have a lot of relevant experience. And I've never had to prove myself in that regard before. There was workplace dynamics that like changed too. I used to be very pro drinking at work, like, you know, back in the day, a long time ago. And then now I find it like stressful because the way some people behave when they're like a little bit drunk, especially at company events, is they tend to, I don't know, boundaries are more difficult. And like, yeah, I've been at companies who have like a zero tolerance policy for, you know, contact and stuff like that. And that's great on the surface, but that doesn't prevent something from happening, like in a certain situation, like especially like if like people are bringing friends who aren't with the company. That's like something new that like where it's like, gosh, I used to be like the person like, hey, anyone want a shot like at 4 p.m. And then now I'm like, well, y'all can take shots somewhere else, but don't do it at work because I want everyone to feel comfortable and safe and not feel compelled to do things that put them in difficult situations or for people to behave in a way that puts other people in difficult situations. So that's been like also a new thing. But overall, I think remote has been like really good for some of these dynamics. Like there's no bathroom question with remote. Like it's just go to the bathroom. It's like great. And there's like this whole thing that like I remember when I worked in San Francisco and I wasn't remote, and I would just decide that the clothes that I was wearing to work that day weren't passing enough, so I'd get stuck at Ross's on the way to work, like picking out new clothes that like felt like, and I just don't have to deal with that as much anymore. I don't really have to worry about like whether I pass at work or anything. Zoom's been great for that. Like it's just like you can kind of can be more insulated, and so it's just been a lot easier. It's just mainly like the interviewing process has been a little bit weird. And when I just sense that there's a little bit of something off about it, like there's a lot of companies out there. It's like I can find another company, and then I don't, and also just like the cost of making a mistake in that regard. Like you don't want some uncomfortable situation to turn up like 6 months later. So usually like I'm asking a lot of questions during the interview process that are like conflict oriented and escalation oriented questions. Like when's the last time someone escalated a conflict like on your team, and how did people handle it? How do you handle accountability on your team? How do you handle transparency? Like what do you do to promote vulnerable communication? How do you surface conflict and tensions, and do you feel safe surfacing conflict and tension on your team? I try to ask those types of questions because if they like stutter and they don't know immediately, then I just know like that, oh, okay, that kind of company where it's like vulnerability is like secret and held tight, and like people don't want to like lose face and that kind of stuff. And I won't work for a company like that. So
yeah, I really appreciate you sharing that. I think that's really valuable, and especially to consider in the Web3 ecosystem, because a lot of the jobs now for crypto, blockchain, peer-to-peer, decentralized related companies are remote, or at least to a larger degree than we would see in more traditional Web2 companies. But I think we do still have to remember to like be discerning and take things with a grain of salt, and interview the company. You know, while we are being interviewed, also interview them. Because it's not really, we're not in a place where we can assume that just because it's newer and, you know, cares about some of the similar values that we care about, decentralization, anti-censorship, all that stuff, that doesn't necessarily mean that the organization itself operates under a model that, you know, aligns with all of our values, and that will ensure that we can be safe and productive in that environment.
I will say one thing I like to do with especially blockchain like Web3 companies is I'll like just go view the source of their page and see what analytics calls they're making. Because it's just really funny sometimes, because they'll have this really flashy we're all about privacy and like all this kind of stuff, and I'll look at the events that are being tracked, and they've got like 10 different trackers going to mixed panel segment, Google Analytics, I almost certain that no one in engineering or no one who has like this is like all the marketing side, and that's something that I notice happens a lot with Web3 companies is that they have like this engineering core that's like has this vision, and they have like this lofty mission and stuff like that. But then the marketing people like just like are going like ham with all of the user data, and there's like no auditing, and so it's kind of funny just like to give it a little quick sniff test to see like what's going on behind the scenes, like even on their public website.
Yeah, totally. That's a good like pro tip when you're interviewing. See what calls they're making on their web pages.
Yeah.
Okay, so we only have a few minutes left, so I want to open it up for any other questions that we have. So if people do have questions, feel free to unmute and you can just share them or drop questions in the chat as well. Gabrielle, any other questions from you?
Yeah, I think as folks are kind of figuring something out, I would love to hear like anything else that you would like to say to our audience in terms of the hiring process, going through that. Are there any tips and tricks or just any other info you'd like to share?
I think the biggest thing is like for me and like with my career development is like the importance of teams and connections, like and building relationships with people you already work with. Like the best jobs that I've gotten have all been jobs I never had to interview for. Like honestly, it's because I made a really good impression on someone I worked with on a previous team, and then like a couple years later, they're like, "Hey, what you up to?" And then will you work for us? And then I'm like, "Yeah." And then I start work like a couple weeks later, and then it's like a good situation like that. The best jobs are like that. But if you're like spending time like drilling how to search a binary tree, like I don't know, I would just like I don't like to be in that position, and I have done that before. I've interviewed for like bank companies and stuff like that, but it's just like I think it's hard like to recognize that you're like the thing that's scarce most of the time. It's like they get to work with you, not you get to work with them. In a lot of cases, and I think that's like the other dynamic is just like how important it is to like not have to be right like on teams. And I feel like the best relationships I've built up are relationships where like I was willing to be vulnerable and say that I don't know how to do something, or like I asked for help a lot. And when you ask people for help, you're like building like this trust dynamic that you don't know everything, and then you're working together with them and you're being vulnerable, and like people will answer that with like their own vulnerability, and they'll ask you for help, and then that builds like relationships. So it's like when like I think getting that next job like really goes into like your previous positions, like who do you remember that you worked and like reaching out to those people, keeping up on like those types of relationships, connections, staying in contact. I feel like the times where I have like done like the traditional interview process, I haven't really enjoyed working at that company too much, because I had to like build up a new relationship and convince them that like I could be trusted, and I just haven't had as fun time doing that. Not to say that if you're doing that process that it's like not going to work out. I'm not saying that. It's just that I feel like I feel like that needs to happen a couple times, but I think just like building relationships is really important to like, because then you already have the trust with them, like, and you can trust in that like going forward in the future, and then you don't have to rebuild that up, and you don't have to worry if they're like like you're like their token hire or something like that. And yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, definitely. I guess if we have time, Val, I would love to ask if do you have any communities or businesses that are making the Web3 space more equitable for women, genderqueer, and non-binary individuals?
Yeah, you know, I was really plugged in with this in San Francisco, and I know like Rails Bridge and Code, those were like all really cool organizations. There was also a lot of organizations that were working in the criminal justice space to provide opportunities for different people to like get intros to tech companies and things like that. You know, that's one thing I do miss, like moving out of the Bay Area, is that like it was really cool to find out about Bloom. That's like I like the work that you're doing. It's like a lot of times it's like I'll just hear about a company from a connection that's doing something in that space. Honestly, like I've been really heads down for a while. Like ever since I moved out of San Francisco, like I've gotten more into creative stuff, and it's like I'm less. I don't know. I just got fed up with the tech community. Honestly, when I was in San Francisco, it just started to feel really dystopian, like to me, and I started to get jaded. Like, and I mean, honestly, like the first blockchain company I worked for, I wasn't even like I was like I had made a pledge to never work a full-time job again, like at that time. But I needed to travel around the world, and so I needed to support that. So I started working for them. But like once I started to like get into what we were working with, like I started really, I don't know, I started feeling like this is actually gonna like turn out to be something really cool if this takes off. Like decentralized currency and governance and stuff like that. So. I miss the events though sometimes in like the bigger cities, like the full meetups and stuff like that. And it's like I think it's like I still like visiting San Francisco for that reason. Like I was part of several organizations that like were very social focused, like not necessarily in the tech space, but like food distribution and stuff like that. And I met a lot of really cool people through those organizations that focus like on trans rights and different types of social justice movements around gender equity. And that does exist here. Like here in Louisiana, we have Operation Spark, but I feel like any like really good organization shouldn't be that big, and then therefore it's hard to find out about. Like either it's like hyper local or it's not that big, and if it's too big, then I get suspicious of it.